Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear me.
Yes, sir, we can.
Great. Thank you for staying up into the evening to listen to me. I appreciate your patience and your willingness to be convenient for me. David Larson. I'm here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Today, I'm going to make a presentation. I'm really looking forward to a conversation with you. I don't pretend to understand all cultures. But on the other hand, I'm not entirely naive. I've traveled to more than 20 countries. I've taught and worked all around the world. I've presented and taught at Chinese universities in Australia, Scandinavia, across Europe. I had the opportunity to run a program about reimagining negotiation in Istanbul, Turkey a few years ago. And that was an exciting experience where we paid a lot of attention to being sensitive to cultural differences. I've got a daughter who's adopted from China, so we actually have a transnational family, and we've tried to make China part of our life to kind of respect and integrate her heritage into our family. Professionally, well, I've taught labor and employment law and employment discrimination law for more than 30 years. I was at the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, at the Appellate Division at the headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I worked on the cases that after there's a trial, there's the opportunity in a common law system to appeal those decisions. So I worked in the agency that appealed the employment discrimination law cases. I also worked on, in the United States, we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I worked on drafting the regulations and the interpretive guidance for the disability-related legislation. I also was an arbitrator for the Omaha tribe, and I think that's relevant because in the United States, the Native American tribes are semi-sovereign entities. So they have some independence from the federal government. And it really was a true cross-cultural experience where I sat as an arbitrator with members of the Omaha tribe and the Winnebago tribe. I was the only non-native person on these arbitrations, and I think it really helped me become more sensitive to cultural differences. I've also been an administrative law judge and a hearing examiner for the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission, and that's the agency that's kind of the state level equivalent of the federal United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that hears the employment discrimination cases at more of the local level, at the state level. And that happened while I was living in Omaha, Nebraska and teaching at Creighton University School of Law. So today I'm really looking forward to this presentation and particularly to a conversation. So I hope you join me when I finish talking at you. That's not the part I enjoy the most. The part I enjoy the most is when I can listen to you and respond to you, and I really look forward to your thoughts and your opinions. I'm not going to tell you how you need to organize your own workplaces. Trust me, I'm not that arrogant. But as I learn more about Saudi Arabia, I think you're entering a tremendously exciting period with Saudi Vision 2030, and there's going to be some amazing changes. Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman believes Saudi Arabia can become a global investment powerhouse, and I don't see any reason why that's not true. But as you read through the Saudi Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia 2030 document, there's different parts, and one part of it calls for companies locating new offices and facilities around the world. Well, assuming that's going to happen, and that Saudi Arabia and companies in Saudi Arabia are going to move offshore and into other areas, it becomes critical that leadership in businesses and corporations understand the cultures and values in those other locations. So one thing I hope to do today is just introduce you and acquaint you with some of those requirements and values and some of the cultural differences in Europe and North America, Australia, more of the Western civilization. But also, as you read through that Saudi Arabia 2030 report, there's a call for opening up Saudi Arabia too, and inviting foreign investment and other individuals to come work in Saudi Arabia, which means that demographics are likely going to change within Saudi Arabia, and the ways in which your workplaces are organized and managed may be changing. So on the one hand, I think the vision is tremendously exciting, but it's got to be a little unsettling too, because when change is coming and there's uncertainty involved with change, well, everybody gets a little anxious. So between the two, the anxiousness and the excitement, I hope that businesses and individuals in Saudi Arabia are focusing on the excitement, because I think the future is very promising. Okay, so I'm talking about how eliminating harassment can make workplaces more productive. So I'm going to start with this notion of whether we should care whether our employees are happy. It certainly seems like a logical proposition. It's not always easy to prove. Causal relationships can be challenging. Cause and effect in social science can be very tricky. But one particularly interesting study that I saw from a couple years ago is a company, Glassdoor, which is a global placement agency, and they do a lot of empirical work with companies and with productivity and with job satisfaction. And 2 years ago, they released a report that showed a correlation between companies recognized with positive cultures and then their stock market performance. And they looked at investors who bought shares on their best places to work ranking. And what they found out is that investors who bought in those companies, their returns significantly outperformed the Standard & Poor's 500 index, which is the stock index in the United States of not strictly and literally the 500 largest companies, but it's really representative, looking at several other indicators of the largest companies in the United States. They compared to the best places to work on their list. They also looked at Fortune's 100 best companies to work for list, and they got the same kind of results. If you look at Glassdoor's list of best places to work, the annualized return was 22.4% compared to 14.1% for the Standard & Poor's index from 2009 to 2014. So it's a 50% increase, which is surprising and I think quite impressive. If you don't look at those 5 years collectively and you look at each year independently, it's still a 21.3% return. If you look at the companies on Fortune's list and had you invested in those instead of just all the companies in the 500 S&P 500 index, again, you would have significantly outperformed the general index with a 20.4% annual return. On the other hand, they also have lists of which are the places that employees don't like to work. And the companies that employees did not love significantly underperformed the market with an only 11.1% average of annualized return. So just as starters, what that strongly suggests is that when employees like where they work, they're going to be more productive, the company's going to be more profitable, and leadership will be pleased with the returns. Social science studies, psychologists have tried to induce happiness. And we could talk for a long time as what makes somebody happy. You could have great debates. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that happiness was to lie in a boat, drifting aimlessly, feeling like a god, which I suppose is not really a very clear picture of being of productivity. So it can be a little bit elusive, but I think at the extremes of whether somebody's happy or unhappy, it generally is pretty clear. And you can see, if nothing else, in the way their body language and how they're expressing their emotions. Are they smiling or are they crying? So in social science studies, psychologists have tried to induce happiness to then measure what happens when somebody's happy and they're given certain tasks. as opposed to what happens when they're not happy, and does that influence productivity? So they created an action or event that changes a person's mood and makes them happy. And one study suggests that, well, when people are happy at work, when they're comfortable, when they're satisfied, they'll increase the amount of time they spend on their more creative tasks, which may lead to greater productivity. And there's lots of literature on this, and if you're at all interested, I encourage you to look at it. Other studies find that people who frequently feel joy, satisfaction, contentment, enthusiasm are going to be more likely to succeed at work. There's economics and managerial studies, moving away from psychology. Longitudinal data for Europe indicates 1 standard deviation increase in job satisfaction results in a 6.6% increase in value added for hours worked. So again, another increase in productivity measurement. Another study said that, or found that when participants were told that what they would do would advance science, they were fully engaged in work. But when they were told that they would get a small additional payment for doing a particular task, they were less motivated. And that was, I think, an interesting study. If you're told that you'll advance science, kind of a higher calling, people were more engaged and worked a little harder. When it's just getting some money, they were a little less motivated. And that suggests that if we're intrinsically motivated, if we're liking what we're doing, we feel good about the goal, that we can affect and increase productivity. And then one other study looked at about 800 subjects, and what they tried to do is see whether or not laboratory results would be the same kind of results they'd get in the real world. So in a laboratory, they showed a comedy video clip, and they found that that video clip resulted in about 10% increase in output with no deterioration in quality. And what they were doing, they were asking people to add together 5 two-digit numbers. So you get a 15, a 22, a 56, an 81, and a 97. And they're presented horizontally, and you're asked to add them up. So when people had watched the video clip, they did better in terms of their output, in their ability to add those 5 two-digit numbers together. And they looked at some real-world experiences, and they tried to identify major unhappiness shocks. And they talked to individuals who had suffered bereavement, deaths in their family, and family illnesses, and had lower happiness because of those relatively tragic incidents. And they had 10% lower productivity. And what this particular study concluded is that, well, if you have happiness shocks, you can increase productivity, and unhappiness shocks will have the contrary result, and they'll have a negative impact on productivity. But is happiness the same everywhere? Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. This is a Saudi Arabian individual that you probably know about. He's been extremely successful and acquired substantial resources, and has done some very impressive work in terms of trying to address poverty around the world. And one thing that Poverty Action Lab has identified and discovered is that, and we shouldn't be surprised, is that cultural norms affect how people respond to incentives. So if we're talking about trying to make certain that our employees are happy or content or satisfied with the goal of them being more productive, we do have to be attentive to cultural norms. And high-income countries, for example, link pay to performance, and that's less likely in low-income countries. And the level of individualism in a given society may determine the extent to which individual success rewards are motivational. So if you're in a less culturally individualism is less culturally valued in low-income countries. And because that's true, then performance pay will be less effective. So the Poverty Lab did a really interesting study with secondary school educated Ghanaian applicants for data entry jobs. Ghana scores very low on the Hofstede individualism scale. It's a particularly collectivist, non-individualist culture. So the study focused on data entry for a couple of reasons. Data entry is a common economic activity in low-income countries. And the Poverty Lab is focusing, of course, on lower-income countries. And then secondly, data entry is highly measurable. For example, you can just look at keystrokes per hour. So about 300 individuals were given either one or two-day contracts. And the contracts were structured in different ways, 5 different ways. Some were given flat wages, some were given individual piece rate compensation, some were given individual piece rate with rank, that if you had a higher position, you were given more compensation. Some were given a group piece rate, depending on the persons with whom they were working. Some were given a group piece rate with rank. And the idea being, if we vary our compensation arrangements, are we going to see any kind of difference in terms of productivity and effort? Well, this study concluded that the incentives offered had no significant effect on productivity, on work quality, or overall firm profitability, and that the results did not differ by sex, ability, or experience. So as we think about our employees and whether or not they're content and satisfied, and hopefully as a result more productive, we do also have to think about what kinds of incentives and environment and motivational efforts we're making, and pay some attention to what's going to resonate with our particular populations. And that's within the borders of Saudi Arabia, and as Saudi Arabians move offshore and move into other countries, those things may change. Incentive-based pay will be more effective in countries with individuals and scores closer to those like the United States and United Kingdom. So lab studies, well, you know, the one advantage of them is it's a controlled environment. A Social Market Foundation study took 2 randomly selected groups and made one change in their situation. That's what you can do. You can try and isolate groups and try and make all conditions static, and then make one alteration between 2 groups, and hopefully be able to understand the impact of that one change. So this study used happiness shocks. They call them happiness shocks. They're not necessarily shocking, but that's the phrase used in the field. So in this instance, they showed comedy sketches by a well-known comedian. Same kind of study. Here's 5 2-digit numbers. We're going to ask you to add them together and see how quickly you can do it and how accurately you can do it. And will your scores go up when you are feeling happy and in a good mood? So the study measured productivity by looking at the number of correct additions, the number of addition attempts, how much effort were you putting in, and then the percentage of correct additions. So those would match up to an overall measure of productivity with the number of correct additions. The number of addition attempts would be a proxy for effort, and the percent of correct additions would be a proxy for precision. And the people running the study did try to equal out abilities between the groups. They gave mathematical reasoning tests to the individuals in an effort to evenly distribute ability types between the mood-induced group and the group that was not. So they tried to make the groups as similar as they could in terms of innate ability or ability pre-test. So does increase in happiness cause a boost in productivity? Well, once again, they found over 10% more successful additions. They controlled for underlying ability, gender, and session. Was there an increase in effort or was there an increase in precision? Well, there wasn't necessarily an increase in precision, but there was a highly significant increase in effort. So again, that suggests that if people are feeling good about where they work and they're comfortable, productivity should go up. There was even a greater rise in effort for drinks and snacks, even better than the comedy video. So the benefit, whether there's a benefit or not, wasn't necessarily dependent on the specific type of happiness shock, but the more powerful, the greater the happiness shock, the greater the productivity boost. And they also tried to identify and isolate individuals who had had bad life events within 3 years, and what they determined was that they were noticeably less happy and less productive. So what does all this mean? Well, generally, if you're looking at economic growth, you'd say that a 3% rise in gross domestic product would be substantial. But if these happiness shocks and increasing people's feelings, positive feelings about the workplace, can result in 10 to 20% increase in productivity, well, that's impressive. I think that's important and has some important implications. Happiness appears to encourage effort, and some tasks benefit more from increased effort. How do you boost happiness? Well, there's lots of ways to do it with positive feedback, improve the working environment, better interaction among workers, better relationships between management and employees. And that gets us now into the workplace harassment. So we've got the Saudi Vision 2030, encourages businesses to expand their presence and influence around the world. So as Saudi Arabian companies move abroad, they have to become familiar with foreign domestic rules. Additionally, empirical evidence supports the position that employees' happiness and well-being affects productivity. So it can't hurt to review workplaces at home, also within Saudi Arabia. So as I continue talking, I'm going to ask you to at least think about what it means if you're going to move your businesses to different parts of the world, and how are you going to acquaint yourself with kind of the rules and regulations and cultures in different parts of the world, so that your employees are encouraged to be productive, but also to reflect a little bit on your own workplaces within Saudi Arabia, and whether or not you're satisfied that within your workplaces, employees have a sufficiently good feeling about the work, that they're being as productive as possible. So there's lots of different definitions of workplace harassment, and over the years, I've looked at lots of different countries. Here's one from Australia, the Australian Government Department of Innovation, Industry, Science and Research. And what they tell us is that workplace harassment has a devastating effect. It creates fear, anxiety, and stress, which can both cause and exacerbate physical illness. It can reduce work performance, which is what we're talking about today. It can increase absenteeism, which also affects productivity. And it can cause employees to resign, which is, for most workplaces, a pretty significant loss, because it takes a lot of time and money to hire new employees and train them. When we're talking about workplace harassment and the environment that we're going to shape, it's always a balance, because on the one hand, you certainly want to eliminate unproductive behavior, but on the other hand, you don't want to be so restrictive that that normal workplace-related relationships and social activities aren't happening. Recognize that people of different interests and backgrounds need to treat each other with respect and courtesy. Behavior that is unwelcome, unsolicited, unreciprocated, and often, although not necessarily repeated, would fall within what most people call workplace harassment. Ask whether or not the conduct that you're witnessing or that you've heard about is likely to offend, humiliate, or intimidate. Is it making it difficult for targeted individuals to work effectively? It doesn't have to be intentional in terms of, you don't have to intentionally offend or harass. It can actually just be misdirected, but doesn't make it any less damaging as a target of that kind of behavior. And when we think about workplace harassment, we really need to be focusing on the impact on the target or the recipient of that behavior. We're talking about the workplace, work-related events, seminars, conferences, holiday parties, business trips. Workplace harassment actually extends out beyond the workplace in the work-sponsored activities. Offensive physical contact, nobody should be surprised by that. Derogatory language, intimidating actions, insulting or threatening gestures. All of these things certainly can make the workplace a less comfortable environment, and consequently a less productive environment. Continual unwanted shouting in the workplace, unjustified, unnecessary comments about a person's work or capacity for work, openly displaying pictures, posters, graffiti, written materials that might be offensive, threatening, abusive, or offensive phone calls, email, or messages on computer networks, persistent following or stalking within the workplace, going to and from work, excluding individuals or groups from normal conversations, work assignments, work-related social activities, networks. Legitimate comment and advice on workplace performance is necessary, and it's certainly permissible, but it should not be humiliating or threatening. So that's one perception of what is workplace harassment coming from Australia. As I mentioned when I began, I served at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission headquarters in Washington, D.C. So I've spent my lifetime looking at employment discrimination issues and workplace harassment. If you are locating your business in the United States, if you're expanding in that direction or in North America, particularly in the United States, well, what you'll discover, which is true in other common law countries, Europe on the one hand has pretty much consolidated its labor codes. Unfortunately for both businesses in the United States and individuals coming into the U.S., when you come into the U.S., you have to deal with a whole series of acts and kind of put them all together, sort of a potpourri of employment rules and regulations. But you have the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination and workplace harassment based upon race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. You've got the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which prohibits discrimination based upon age. You've got the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination based upon disability. But as I talked about a little bit earlier, so you have federal legislation. You'll also have state legislation. An example, in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which is slightly different than the federal act. For instance, it covers smaller employers than the federal act does, and covers even more groups, protects even more groups than the federal statute. And you might even have city legislation, and we do in the city of St. Paul. You can have city ordinances that protect against certain kinds of unproductive behavior. A definition that we use in the United States, and just think about it as a conceptual definition, just to get some appreciation of the concept. It might not be exactly how you would define it, but I'm just using it as an example. But we look to see whether or not there's unwelcome conduct of a racial, color, religious, sexual, national origin, age, or disability nature, or is it based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability that's either so severe or pervasive that it's so shocking or outrageous, or simply so persistent that it's the same thing over and over, that it alters conditions of employment and creates an abusive working environment. So lots of things to think about. Is the conduct really unwelcome? It may be that the person complaining yesterday was doing exactly the same thing, which would be some evidence that maybe they don't really think it's unwelcome. So that's one of the determinations that you would need to make when trying to decide whether or not there's unwanted harassment going on. Should it make a difference if it's a coworker or a manager or a supervisor? Yeah, I think it should make a difference. If it's a coworker, in the United States, we say that, well, it's a negligence standard. If a coworker is harassing another coworker, we ask whether or not the employer acted reasonably in terms of trying to either prevent or address that conduct. But if it's a manager or supervisor doing the harassing, well, we're a little more concerned about that. In fact, if a manager or supervisor is saying something like, if you agree and give me a sexual favor that I'm requesting, I will raise your salary $1,000, or if you don't do it, I'll cut your salary, or I'll demote you. Well, if it's a tangible benefit or a tangible detriment, our feeling is that there should be strict liability, that the employer, if they give somebody the power to be a manager and have that kind of power over employees, and they're abusing it in that way, then the employer should have strict liability, no defenses. If there's no tangible benefit, no raise being promised, no demotion or salary cut being threatened, we would call that a hostile environment. And if it's a hostile environment, then employers do have a defense if the employer acts reasonably to prevent the conduct or correct it promptly, and the employee, on the other hand, unreasonably failed to take advantage of preventive or corrective opportunities. If the employee could have stopped it by going to somebody and complaining but didn't, and it went on for months simply because they didn't alert anybody, well, that might be a defense for the employer. So, as you expand your businesses and locate facilities outside of Saudi Arabia, I encourage you to familiarize yourself with local rules and regulations regarding workplace harassment, because as you know, wherever you go, you're going to be subject to foreign domestic law. And it certainly isn't consistent, and there's going to be maybe even great differences, and if not, there's certainly going to be nuances. And is a company operating with foreign locations, you're going to be subject to those foreign domestic rules and regulations. But even if you're not contemplating locating your offices or facilities outside of Saudi Arabia, I submit that employees will be more productive and your businesses will be more successful if employees are comfortable at work. And it's not only that they'll be more productive, but they'll be more loyal. And as you know, that it costs time and money to identify, hire, and train new employees if you have resignations. So there's a lot of value to keeping your employees both productive and loyal so that they stay with you for a significant amount of time. Workplace harassment is complex, it's confusing. As I mentioned earlier, one confusing aspect is, was this conduct truly unwelcome to this particular employee? And also perhaps the hypothetical reasonable employee. You can have hypersensitive employees that they themselves are unreasonable. And if the ordinary employee wouldn't find it problematic and it's the kind of interaction that goes on regularly, perhaps it's not the kind of harassment that you need to be concerned about because it's very idiosyncratic to this employee. On the other hand, if the employee, even if they're hypersensitive, if it's somebody that's productive and you'd like to keep them working for you, just because other individuals aren't offended by what's going on doesn't mean you wouldn't want to address that and maybe make the situation a little more comfortable and possible. I think we should be especially concerned about the conduct of supervisors and managers when it comes to workplace harassment, because they have such great control over other employees' lives, over their wages, over their workplace conditions, or about the condition of their families. If something bad happens at work and they become less productive and they earn less wages, that's going to have impact that go beyond just the employee, him or herself. So I'm trying to stay on schedule. I think I actually did. I hope my comments are helpful. I believe that comfortable employees are more productive, but comfort and happiness are significantly affected by culture. We should think carefully about what will make our workers happy or unhappy based upon our culture and values. I am certainly not an expert when it comes to Islam. I do have some association with Muslims. There is an organization in the United States called the Council on American and Islamic Relations, CAIR, C-A-I-R, and I have been a participant with that organization and also a financial supporter of them. As you are aware, in different places of the world, there's a condition called Islamophobia, where there are stereotypes being imposed on individuals based upon the actions of a few, and the CARE organization is dedicated to making certain that those stereotypes are addressed and removed, and trying to improve relations between cultures. And so I don't in any sense believe that I have a deep understanding of Islam, but on the other hand, I'm not entirely unfamiliar with the religion and, for example, the Sunni pillars. And as we think about the 5 Sunni pillars, we've got the third pillar, and I'll use the English translation of charity. And to the degree I know about that Sunni pillar of charity, I think often when it's described is in terms of generosity, in terms of removing economic inequalities, maybe making financial and monetary donations. And if you can't do that, maybe you can do other things to reduce inequality. But I don't think it's inconsistent with that pillar to talk about unequal conditions at work also. And if we're concerned about reducing inequality, then we also, I think, should be concerned about making certain that everybody at work is being treated equally, fairly and respectfully. So again, I leave this for you to think about because you have so much more knowledge and experience. But as you think about the Sunni pillars and the Shia pillars, I think that the kinds of things I'm talking with are consistent with those pillars of Islam. I believe that wherever we are in the world, there can be conduct that's offensive, harmful, and unproductive. And I think that we should do all that we can to prevent it. So I hope, I hope the audio worked. I hope you heard everything I said. I'm very interested in hearing your comments and reflections. So I hope our moderator now can open up the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And folks, we are open for question and answers. So if you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box, or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the console, so you can click and I can give you an opportunity to speak to the speaker directly. We have a couple of questions posted already. The first one, do employees themselves have any responsibility to stop the harassment?
Yeah, that's a good and interesting question. Yeah, I don't know necessarily to stop it, but they do have some responsibility because you can't hold the employer responsible to know every single thing that happens in the workplace. Sometimes they need to be informed. They need to get information from the employees themselves, what's going on. So I think that unless it's open and obvious, then I think that the employees sometimes do have a responsibility themselves to bring the conduct to the attention of the employer. Often harassment doesn't happen in the open. Often it happens in a more private area where the employer can't see it, isn't even aware of it, and unless the employer is aware of it, they can't really address it. So yes, I do think that employees have some responsibility, if not to stop it, which may be impossible in certain conditions, but to at least bring it to the attention of the employer so it can be addressed.
Thank you very much. We have another one. Let me see. Okay, what preventive measures can an employer take to ensure unwanted harassment does not occur?
Well, one thing I think employers can do is be clear about your policies. In direct, clear language, set out a policy that's accessible to everybody, that spells out your expectations as to what kind of behavior is acceptable in your workplace. There's going to be certain kinds of conduct, for example, unwanted physical touching, that certainly you would want to prohibit in your workplace. So one thing you can do is have a clear, widely disseminated anti-harassment policy that defines what kinds of conduct is not permissible in the workplace, because honestly, there are some individuals who really don't know what's acceptable in the workplace and what isn't. Another thing you might want to do is that you might want to set up what could be considered alternative avenues of complaint, meaning that you don't want to have a situation where we've said already that the employees have some responsibility to bring situations to the attention of the employer. But if a supervisor is harassing an employee, and in your company, the chain of command says that any complaint you have about harassment should go to your own supervisor, well, that's obviously a problem, because it's not going to be very productive for the target of the harassment to complain to the person that's actually harassing them. So another preventive measure employers can take is to set up alternative avenues of complaint, so that if somebody is being targeted by one supervisor, there should be another pathway for that person to bring it to the attention of the employer. Because again, if there's only one route and it's through the person that's committing the harassment, it's not going to get resolved.
Thank you very much. Let me move to another question. What should an employee do first if an employee complains about unwelcome harassment? Should we transfer the employee to protect him or her?
Yeah, so what do? So you're the employer, and somebody comes to you and says that I'm being harassed. It's interfering with my ability to do the work. If you look at my productivity measurements, it's going down. It's not because I don't want to work hard, but my work is being interrupted. Can you, now I've kind of talked myself out of the question. Can you repeat the question?
Sure, let me read it over. What should an employer do first if an employee complains about an unwelcome harassment? Should we transfer the employee to protect him or her?
Yes. Okay, so so somebody complains, and your first response or reaction may be to transfer the complaining employee out, get them away. And that's not an illogical response to try and protect them. But the problem is that in one sense you may be punishing the victim because they may like where they're working, they may like their coworkers. They just have a problem with one person. They don't want to be transferred, and a transfer may mean a new task for them, that they have to learn something new, which will increase the pressure on them. They may be leaving coworkers who they really like. So I think that that a better response is if you're going to separate them, and you probably should separate the person that is the alleged harasser, um, in order to avoid punishing the complainant. Now, again, as I mentioned, can be fairly delicate and fairly complex because, as you know, in life you can have false accusations. So you certainly don't want to immediately and absolutely condemn the alleged harasser because what's being alleged may not be true. I think you should separate them depending on the severity of the alleged harassment, but you do need to have an investigation before you do anything final. I don't think the immediate response should be termination, unless, again, there was something very severe and very obvious. Somebody commits a physical act in the full view of other workers, so there's no question that it happened and its severity is very clear. Well, in an instance like that, you might act summarily. But if it's something that happened in private, that there aren't a lot of witnesses, you're not sure exactly what happened, it's probably a good idea to not transfer the alleged victim, but at least to separate the alleged harasser, but to then conduct an investigation before you do anything final, like demoting or even terminating the alleged harasser.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question. What if all the employees are comfortable with certain conduct, but one employee complains? Is that a problem?
Yeah, that's an interesting situation. What if you have a kind of a rough workplace, and employees who have been there for a while all kind of engage in conduct that most of us may find offensive, and even raising to the level of harassment. What do you do in those circumstances? Well, I think that the long-term goal is to make most workplaces comfortable for most individuals. And even though there might be a division or department that acts in a particular manner, the problem is that over the long term, that department's going to be exclusionary. There's going to be many individuals who won't ever want to work there, and that's not going to be good for the company because you're losing potential talent. People that might have been very good in that particular job or in that department won't want to be there. So even though the current employees may be comfortable with a certain kind of behavior, thinking long term and the kind of talent that might be available out there, I think you do need to not necessarily accept it as the status quo and expect new employees or single employees to go along with that. That you maybe need to educate those workers and begin to try and transition that behavior away from that rougher, more aggressive context to something that's a little more inviting.
Well, thank you very much, Professor David. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Well, I was very excited when I read about the Saudi Vision 2030, and I can imagine all kinds of changes coming to Saudi Arabia, and tremendous opportunities both within the borders and around the world. So I would love to stay in touch with people in Saudi Arabia to learn how that vision is progressing. And I hope that what I talked about today might be of some assistance or support in moving in those directions.
Well, definitely would like to stay in touch and engage with you also. So once again, I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for taking the time to deliver this live webinar with us. So thank you very much, Professor. And thank you all of those who attended the webinar. We are recording, so please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to learn about our upcoming programs, webinars, and to access the recorded versions. With that note, we'd like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.